So today we are finishing off, of course, Deuteronomy chapter 19. We have been going through piece by piece. We've gone through this particular chapter in 4 weeks. Okay, the first 10 verses looking at the broader concept of justice and what we call due process, for some of those who know those terms legally, right? The due administration of justice, as we otherwise refer to it. Verses 11 to 13 regarding the command that actually finds itself featured again by repetition here today in verse 21. You shall not pity them, or your eye shall not pity them, but to be specifically this concept that we looked at regarding false piety and perverted pity, misplaced pity upon those who are demonstrably guilty, and the consequences and ramifications that can come in a society when one does that, especially when groups of people do that. Last week, we were obviously following through on verse 14, this kind of bridging text, I suppose, as it were, wherein we were covering the particular aspect regarding justice more broadly and the ideas as well contained therein. And then here today, we are finishing off with a passage that also is in this very same vein or flow regarding justice. Okay? Elements taken from the first half, from the beginning really, first 10 verses, as well as some very particular points that herein are being honed in on that are relevant now, or as relevant now as they ever were 3,500 years ago when these ancient words were first penned. They are words which do contain therein the foundational elements of the entire law code that we know and possess, our very idea and concept, even intellectually on the personal level, of justice, all the way up to that of the national administration of a judicial system, are incumbent and contained within these very words. Much akin to those first 10 verses that I was previously mentioning or referring to. Here we see a very particular example given. Okay, and again, these are examples, right? Archetypes that are given, right? What we'd often sometimes call in judicial circumstances landmark cases, right? The kind of cases that have a big ramification and a defining precedent in case law, okay, that shine as an example or as an exemplar of a very prototypical or stereotypical case. Okay? Here in this particular example, we have, of course, a man accusing another man of XYZ thing. Right? Obviously, the example that was being dealt with in the first half of the chapter was one of murder, right? Very serious things. Okay? But you could insert, quite frankly, any particular issue into this text, right? That obviously is going to scale up or down depending on what we're talking about, okay? But as we see first off, beginning for us in verse 15, a single witness shall not rise up against a man on account of any iniquity, right? In other words, sin, evil, or any sin which he has committed, At the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses shall a matter be established. What we have here is the burden of proof. Some of you will be familiar with that term. Okay? And part of that concept of the burden of proof, in other words, that the burden to actually prove the guilt of the person is not on the individual themselves. In other words, one does not have to prove that they are innocent or not guilty, to use the more specific term. It is upon the accuser that lies or rests the moral and ethical imperative. Okay? You can hopefully, if you have any familiarity with our legal system, see exactly where that's coming from. It's coming from this text directly. Okay? Thousands of years of justice, jurisprudence, in other words, the theory of law, and the exercise, the practice of law in society is built on the words that you're reading here in front of you this morning. Okay? So on account of 2 or 3, in other words, that's a shorthand way of saying multiple. Okay? On account of multiple witnesses shall a matter be established. Okay? Now we have in our complex and highly advanced and developed legal system today, right, of course, building on those not only centuries but now millennia, plural, right, different categories of evidence. You have material evidence, right? So think about your favorite crime television show or something of that accord, right? You have blood spatter at the scene, you have DNA evidence through hair follicles or fingerprints or other such things from whichever example you would like to pick, right? Material evidence. You may have documents, you have emails, you have phone calls, you have all kinds of things, technological, physical, and otherwise, that can serve as evidence, right? You find a bloodied knife with the accused handprint, or in this case fingerprints, upon the murder weapon, right? That is a piece of evidence. By itself, does it prove that the individual did this? No. But when stacked up with other lines of evidence, right, like CCTV footage in 4K, full colour, showing him killing the individual, right, bit of a slam dunk. Multiple witnesses. It could be eyewitnesses, right? Of course, historically, that is normally how things have had to work, right, prior to the inventions of modern forensic technologies, okay? Either way, the point that is being drawn here is that mere accusation, right, mere speculation, conjecture, or worse yet, the trading sleuthily of gossip does not constitute guilt. Does that make sense? Okay. The mere fact that someone has been accused of something is not evidence of anything. Because the reality is that you can quite frankly accuse anyone of anything at any time. Okay? Even the accusation from multiple people, merely accusing, is not enough. Right? Mob accusation is not actual evidence. Right? Witnesses, things that actually substantively demonstrate, not only individually but more importantly when taken together, the likelihood of this person being guilty. It is precisely why, speaking of legal things, we have varying standards of proof between criminal and civil codes, right? So in criminal cases, really serious ones, the most serious kind, right? Many of you will know the phrase, right? That whether it be by individual judge or by jury, depending on jurisdiction, depending on crime, depending on level of court, etc., right? The defendant must be found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Okay? So would a reasonable person, would a reasonable human being doubt the line of evidence that has been presented by the prosecution? In our case, KCs, right? King's counsels. Now, the reliability upon reasonable people these days might be questionable, but that's a whole other matter. The reality is that these things have been given for the sake of truth and of justice. Okay. Now, even just this first opening portion here, just verse 15 alone, could almost in its own right function as a standalone sermon. Right? In fact, I did ponder whether to break this passage down into multiple weeks for that very reason. Right? For our sake and for the sake of coherency as well as flow, we're going to take it all together, right? Verses 15 to 21. Right? My reasoning for saying that, though, so as to not bury the lead, is because multiple points of today's content, right, are things which we deeply struggle with, are things which are really genuine issues in our society. Okay? We have it by way of two opposing forces, seemingly opposing forces. Right? We find, for example, the promulgation and the ease by which mere accusation can determine the fates of people through things like corporate media. Right? Think your traditional corporate newspapers, right? TV news stations, etc., those kinds of things, as well as the new media of social media. Right? Ironically, for two very opposing reasons. On the hand of, or in the case of the corporate media, the centralization, the historic authority that they once carried, especially the further back you go, many of you may remember from your childhood when there were but 2 television stations, or 3 television stations, or 4 television stations, right? Not the great multiplicity we have now, right? And you would have some saying 0, yes, there you go, right? You would have such an entirely directed line of authoritative news media being funneled directly into the propaganda box in your living room. Right? That every single night at 6 p.m. or whatever time it was for that news station, sitting down and watching the news, right? If some of you did not have that upbringing, God bless you, right? But most people, of course, did. Throughout the 20th century, that was the way in which that happened in the latter half, obviously, from the kind of 50s, 60s onward. Right? What that does is that crafts a very particular and very contained funnel, okay? Which is why such news organisations have historically been trusted, and then now, of course, for decades have been proven to have been grotesquely and demonically abusing that trust. When you filter news through a singular source, of course, there is the necessary trust that that source is not lying through their teeth, is not manipulating the account of what happened, is not highlighting and shading certain aspects in favour or against other ones that would otherwise give you a greater picture. Okay? That is a very dangerous thing. And every single one of us are subjected to it and bombarded by it every single day. In this arms race that exists in the modern world, where corporate media attempts to desperately hold on to your attention span through 24-hour news cycles, right? Trying to outcompete, hopelessly and vainly admittedly, right, with futility, attempting to outcompete the new form of media through social media, okay? Decentralized media. More and more money, more and more effort, more and more attempt is made to capture your attention at all costs, right? Big red sign comes on screen, breaking news, right? Thing that happened last week also happened again this week, right? Breaking news, thing that is utterly irrelevant to your life in every possible way that you never needed to know happened, right? Breaking news, thing on far side of the world happened that you have no ability to affect, but you should be really angry about, right? All these kinds of things, okay? And understanding, and this is extremely important as it pertains to this idea of 2 or 3 witnesses, in other words, multiple witnesses, multiple lines of evidence, as we would say, right? If you want the technical term in legalese, multiple independent lines of witness, right, or evidence, same thing. The way in which this happens, if I can give you by way of example, okay? And this happens all the time. Some of you will nod your head if you understand the familiarity with this, right? But you can insert and conjure any particular parallel or like example in this regard, right? I'm just going to use one that is very much down the alley of how this works, okay? News story comes up, right? On your 6 p.m. news or whatever it is that you decide to watch, right? Police responded to a domestic violence report, right, at a home in insert suburb, right? They'll show you some B-roll of the street. They'll show you a police cop car out the front, right? They'll have the news reporter standing there on the corner of the street, whatever it is, right? It's a 30-second, 60-second snippet. It doesn't really matter, right? Called to the home of blah, 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 right? Neighbours report the couple fighting in the front yard and the husband yelling at the wife earlier that day. Back to you in the newsroom, okay? Now, what has this story told you? It has told you that there was an allegation of domestic abuse. It's a serious thing, right? A thing that should be taken seriously, right? There is an accusation that has been levelled, right, that a husband has beat up his wife. Police responded, so there's a police incident, and neighbours reported to the police and to the news that earlier that day they had heard the couple fighting and the husband yelling at the wife on the front porch. What do you immediately assume? Well, of course he did it. He must have beaten her up because, after all, the neighbours heard him yelling at his wife earlier that day. And this is the part where we use the 6 inches between your ears, okay? Right? Get all those brain cells firing on the same cylinder and let's actually think rationally and logically. In that example, and by the way, I'm actually using a real example, not from this country, but from US. Does the fact that the husband was yelling at his wife earlier, no details as to what on earth they were yelling about, no context as to what the discussion was even pertaining to, no discussion at all as to whether it was a mutual fight or whether one was just scolding the other, right? Let alone the reasoning, as I said earlier, for why that would be the case. Does the fact that that happened earlier that day demonstrate that he's just beaten his wife to a pulp in the evening? No. Okay. But here's what happens, right? It's what I call Lego manipulation. Okay? There are academic names for this, but I'm not going to bore you with it. It's as if I had to tell you right now, and I'm going to tell you this, right? Blank your mind out, and I want you to focus very clearly. Ready? Are you all ready? Do not think of an elephant. Okay. Now, the people who are honest in God's church this morning will admit that you just thought about an elephant. You either thought about the word elephant, or you thought about the concept of the elephant, or you actually pictured an elephant. I don't know what, right? Even though I said you do not think about an elephant, right? Even for that brief second, virtually all of you will have thought of an elephant. It's just human psychology, right? The way that this works is by placing two separate pieces of information in front of you and not connecting it for you, but instead allowing you to make the connection. Okay? The reason why I called it Lego manipulation is if I was to put in front of two children, or you don't have to put in front of children, quite frankly, these experiments have been done on adults. Put two little pieces of Lego, right, little connecting toys, right, a blue and a red, whatever it wants. Eventually, the person is going to think, that would couple with that one. They would connect. Now, no one's told you to connect those two things. No one has explicitly said that this thing connects to that thing. You do it yourself. And it is one of the single most powerful tools of manipulation that for anyone who knows how to talk and anyone who knows how to engage in rhetoric, anyone who knows how to manipulate an audience can do. Right? That's why you've heard me say to you many times, the single greatest amount of psychological effort that goes into doing what I do every week is constantly riding the brake to make sure that it's your mind and your heart that's engaged, not just merely your heart. Right? I can be much more verbose, much more charismatic, much more energetic, right? Much more theatrical in the way that I speak, right? I have done that at certain settings. Okay? The reason why, by all general account, I keep things level, disciplined, and calm is so that your heart and your mind are working together and I'm not merely pulling your heartstrings. Okay? I can play your heartstrings all day long, as anyone good, and especially anyone who's trained in actual capital R rhetoric can do. Now, that example I gave earlier did not tell you that the husband had beaten up the wife. It instead said they saw them fighting earlier. It instead said that there were police reports, that the neighbours heard an argument. No one actually saw the argument. No one heard specifically what it was about. And then, of course, what does the news segment usually end with? Here's the domestic violence hotline. If you have a problem, call it. So what have they done? They've placed little Lego pieces in front of you. They haven't made the connection. You have. And so you think that you're the one who has arrived at this conclusion. You are not. They have strung you along and planted the thing right in front of you. This is what this verse is stopping. Because in that news segment on the corporate side of things, is there a scintilla of evidence in that 60-second little segment that you saw that actually demonstrates that this guy did anything or not? Other than the fact that, believe it or not, couples have arguments. No. There's no evidence in anything. Now, he may have. He may have. And you could flip this around in everything else, right? A third of all domestic violence cases are women beating up or psychologically abusing their husbands or partners, whatever it is, right? So it wouldn't matter which direction you floated in, right? But all those little pieces, that's how that happens on the corporate side. Because when you look to these figures as an authoritative source of truth, right? How often we hear that phrase during COVID, right? We will be your sole source of truth. Right? If you want to use the literal wording, say for example, of the Kiwi Prime Minister back in the day, right? The same thing echoed here. When it's filtered through one singular source that is human, that is temporal, utterly cut off from the divine, you get manipulation. You get propaganda. Because that's precisely what these things are, propaganda. Right? You have never lived in a more propagandized time in human history than this one. Right? Human beings, speaking of. The other side of that issue, which is now as much of a problem, just in a totally opposite way, ironically, is that of new forms of media, right? Social media. Now, people's interactions with, dependency upon whatever else, social media, of course, will vary largely by generation, right? However, the vast, vast, vast majority of people are on social media in some form or another, right? So the point still stands. Okay? The difference is that in regard to social media, right, at least in the broader sense compared to corporate, it is to one degree, only one degree, the Wild West. Anyone can say anything about anything at any time. Okay, now that's not 100% true because there's actually deep levels of control in regard to the social media corporations, right? But forgetting that for a second, the point I'm trying to get you to see is this, is that when anyone can say anything about anyone, all you do is open the floodgate to speculation, particularly because of the nature and the way by which these social medias operate. Right? Technical algorithms that work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year to pump into your phone, your computer, your whatever device you use, hyper-specific and deeply curated material that it believes you're interested in. Okay? This is why sometimes you may have heard in regard to social media the word echo chamber being used. Okay? To make money, social media companies directly feed you what it believes you're interested in, okay? To get more and more and more of. Okay? So if you only prefer this political party or that political party or this whatever else, right, you will keep getting fed things within the orbit and direction of that thing over and over and over again across the years, okay, to a more and more and more specific degree and level. Right? That's how these things work. That's the simplest way of explaining it. What does that do? Well, what it does is it feeds you, ironically, the same kind of thing that the corporate side does over time. It feeds you a very particular, highly curated, highly edited worldview, opinion, atmosphere, or understanding about whatever it is you're looking at. Right? Where two people's social media feeds can literally look night and day apart, even though it's on the exact same app. Okay? And therein, you are hearing whatever someone posts, with no ability to verify whether that thing is true at all, at least not in isolation. Right? This is how early on, especially 5 years ago, so many people, if they weren't familiar with the way that AI learning models and language models work, right, were able to be duped and fooled by the early stages of AI images or videos. Right? Even to the highest level. Right? Early on in the Ukraine war, for example, right, back in 2022, when that first kicked off, there was an international news story about this enigmatic Ukrainian pilot who had achieved something that no one had achieved since the original Iraq-Iran war back in the 80s, if anyone remembers that. Right? 5 aerial combat kills, which makes you, in military terminologies, a fighting ace. Right? It's a very rare thing to achieve. Okay? 5 aerial combat kills, air-to-air kills. Right? Dogfights in the air, pilot on pilot, 5 victories. Right? Dubbed the Ghost of Kiev. Right? Except the problem is that it was entirely fake. Okay? Right? The AI footage, so the footage of the flybys, the footage of the plane taking off, all these kind of things was all AI generated. It wasn't real, right? The Ukrainian government was pumping out that information as part of the psychological warfare against the Russians. Okay, so if me and their dog is believing it, it's completely fake. Never happened. Right. Do you see now, among quite literally 10 trillion other examples one could possibly bring up, why this sentence says what it says? On the matter of multiple witnesses, multiple pieces of evidence, will a matter be established? Oh, you heard some news story on Facebook or you saw something on channel whatever. So what? And maybe that's true, maybe. But have you done anything to actually corroborate that? Have you done anything, put any effort in whatsoever in your day to actually corroborate whatever you think you heard, right, or saw an article you read or whatever it is, a video, whatever, with other lines of things that would either back that up or not? Have you done that? No? Then why are you telling me about it? I'm not saying that to be harsh. I'm saying that as a blunt reality check. Right? Corporate and social media side of things are PREY, preying upon your natural instinct to trust. They are preying upon your natural inclination to hear something and believe it. Okay? How many times have I told you to not just simply believe me because I'm the guy in the clerical office who gets up every week and talks to you and says things to you? How many times in sermons, when I'm on a particular text or whatever, do I then show you from somewhere else in the Bible how that understanding, i.e. that interpretation, makes sense? All the time. Right? Here, Bible studies, you guys know this. Right? Why do you think we've been running at this point, 40-something part series, lecture series, course on church history? To show you that the things that are being said to you in sermons and Bible studies are not just Dan and his bright ideas. Now, I'm showing you this is what has been believed for thousands of years, what has been understood. This is what has been said. Don't take it from me, take it from these ancient persons, these medieval, so on and so forth. Right? That's the reason for that. Okay? If a matter is not established by multiple evidences or witnesses, same thing, the question is not, did it happen or not? That's irrelevant. The question is, can you, as a human being, believe it? And here's the final point on this particular sentence. Why is that the case? Right? Because, of course, if we hear a story, especially if it's to someone who matters to us, like a friend or even family, right, we obviously naturally want to believe that. Right? The natural instinct to believe is not the problem. Let's be really clear. That's not the issue. That's why I used the term PREY, prey, right, earlier. That media corporations, corporate, social and otherwise, prey predatorily, right, prey upon your natural instinct to trust, okay, to manipulate you. Okay? That's not the problem. The problem is this. You and I, we are not God. We are not omniscient. In other words, we are not all-knowing. We are not hovering above time with some capability by which to see all things that have happened, are happening, and will ever happen. That's not you, and it's certainly not me. Our knowledge is limited. It is finite, not infinite. It's confined. Right? It's confined to what we see, what we hear, what we taste, what we smell. It's confined to the empirical aspects. It's confined to various other things like that if you're talking about things in the moment. Right? So someone tells me that something happened, right? Something serious, right? Or I heard that, blah, 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 right? So it's controversial in that respect, right? Were you there? No. Was the person telling you this thing there? Either yes or no, right? If no, it's even worse. So you're hearing it from someone who heard it from someone, who possibly even heard from someone else. Right? Goodness knows how long that chain goes for. And if they were there, that's only one person. This is the point. You are not God. What this does is it humbles, and it reminds us as people, and particularly as Christians, to be humble. Because would we ever want this kind of accusation and charge and slander, which is ultimately what happens when it's erroneous, right? This is what slander is, to falsely accuse people, right? Verbally, right? Would we want that happening to us? Would we want that happening to a loved one, a family member, a friend? No. Right. So what should we do? We should be probably pretty careful for just diving into the pool of salacious gossip in that regard. Do you understand? That's what this is talking about. Right? And it will be established, because this doesn't preclude things coming to light. Right? Ultimately, what is verse 15 protecting against? It's protecting against credulity, in other words, just blindly believing things, right? Hastily, rashly, easily believing things. That's credulity. Okay? It's also, on the other end, protecting against indifference. Because notice, on the account of 2 or 3 witnesses, a matter will be established. Right? There actually needs to be the undertaking of a process, the one which we're about to read of, right, in the coming verses. So we shouldn't really be indifferent. However, we also should not just automatically believe. This was the devastating consequences, unintended initially most likely, but of course when you let the cat out of the bag, that's what happens, with things even going back 5 years or more, or whatever it is now, to things like the Me Too movement. Now, anyone who heard what I said last week, right, or let alone the week before that, particularly and especially the week before that, right, verses 11 to 13, should know what my position on the sexual assault of people, especially women, is. If you want a refresher, go back and watch my sermon on verses 11 to 13 of this chapter. Right? No one could ever accuse me of being soft on sexual assault and sexual crimes and rape, when I'm the guy telling you that these people should be hung publicly. On the same level, the idea of just simply believe every woman logically just doesn't work. Like, it's so prima facie, face value, obviously incorrect. Every single person who ever makes an accusation, automatically believe. Really. No one would ever lie. There'd never be a reason why any person, in this case talking about the women, would be bitter, jealous, envious. There's never been a bitter, envious, spiteful woman in the history of mankind. Is that what I'm especially meant to believe? Same thing would go for men too, by the way, but in this case we're talking about that movement. Believe every single one, and I mean literally 100%. Well, I had conversations back when that was happening. Right? That's exactly what people believed. That is, and I don't want to be too hyperbolic here, delusional. Delusional. You literally cannot have a functioning society where anyone who makes an accusation is just automatically believed. Oh, you said it happened, or it happened. Right? The fact that you said it happened, forget the court, don't waste time, right? Judge doesn't need to put on the robe and the fancy wig. We're all good. After all, this person said that someone did something somewhere. Matter resolved. Right? It's so self-evidently ludicrous. This protects against both levels of evil. Right? It is evil to just blindly believe. It is also evil to be cold, callous, and indifferent. Do you understand what I mean? The balance is in the middle, and those with wisdom will understand the ethic of what I'm saying here. Especially because of the example that is now given here, verse 16. If a malicious witness rises up against a man and accuses him of wrongdoing, then both of the men who have the disputes, in other words, the accuser and the accused, right, shall stand before the Lord, before the priests and the judges who will be in office in those days. Right, which obviously in this ancient context constituted the actual ecclesiastical and civil magistracy. Right? That's what we talked about in previous chapters, going back to chapter 16, 17, and 18. Okay? I want you to notice something that's given here, right? Because this is a particular example. A malicious witness. Right? Herein, right, so you don't know this in real time, right? Moses is kind of breaking the fourth wall, so to speak, to use that theatrical terminology, right? He is giving the 30,000-foot view, putting you in the place as if you were God, okay, just for the sake of explaining the point, right? This witness is actually malicious. In other words, they are not making the accusation in good faith, okay? This word means exactly what it has. It has malicious, or your English translation will have something to the effect of malicious, right? There's a very interesting aspect to this as well, okay? In a looser context, or even a different context with a bit of a looser semantic, you could translate this word accurately as violent. Okay? Right? Not in this context, right? But as a general, to give you an understanding of the word, right? Because words have various different aspects to them, right? We know this. Malicious, okay? Violent. The kind of violence that is not necessarily speaking of physically attacking, but of the kind of concept of an attack, right? To violate the reputation and integrity of someone else. That's more the aspect, right? So it's an emotional, ethical, psychological violence in that respect, right? This is going to give you an understanding of what's being said, okay? So the example he's talking about here is not someone who was genuinely mistaken about what they think they heard or saw, okay? Because that can happen, right? It can happen where you see part of an event, right? Where the person, even if we just talk about something really nice and simple, right? In the gossip side, so forget the judicial for a second, right? You hear that, I'm just going to use random things here, right? You heard, Bob, who you know is a Christian, right? Bob was in a massive brawl at the pub the other day, right? Police were called and blah, 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 right? They had to pull Bob up, and Bob was absolutely just wailing on this guy, right? That sounds pretty bad, right? What's a Christian doing beating up a dude out in public somewhere, right? He's just absolutely crushing him. You've heard, right? And you see this? It's like, yeah, I was there and I saw it. Well, that's pretty damning, right? We're back to the one witness problem again, though, by the way. Because what you haven't yet found out is that this person who you know, who's a Christian or not a Christian, doesn't matter, saw him beating up the guy, standing over him, beating him to a pulp. Right? The part of that he didn't see, because his back was turned, or he was round the corner, or he's on the other side of the pub, whatever it is the part where the guy he just beat up attacked him first. Who started it? Well, the other guy. So what does that mean Bob's doing in that example? Defending himself. Now, we have ludicrous laws in this country where there is no actual self-defense in a bar fight, right? Anyway, pretending that we actually had some sense of justice and sanity, and it wasn't somewhere that was a pub or where alcohol was served, and it was just out in the street. Doesn't matter where you pick, right? You've heard part of the story, yeah? Now, that person isn't attempting to lie to you, are they? Because they actually did see Bob going full Mike Tyson on this dude in the pub, right? But they didn't see what started it. So they have what? Part of the story, don't they? Okay. So this is not talking about that scenario, right? That person's genuinely mistaken. They're not trying to lie to you and deceive you, right? They are gossiping, to be totally frank with you. But if I ignore that for a second, right? They're not attempting to pull one over on you, are they? They're just actually telling you what they saw. This is not talking about that. This is talking about someone with malice aforethought. Do you see where that term comes from now? Malicious intent, right? Yeah. Malice aforethought falsely accuses someone. That is what this is talking about. Okay? The accuser and the accused need to be brought before the appropriate authority. right? Civil or ecclesiastical, whatever the context was, okay? And needs to be tried. Okay? This is the person, however, and you have to understand this, who the motive behind them, it is not good. It is not honest, it is not fair, it is not just, it is not righteous. The person in this example, the man in this example, is doing this to attack the man that he's accusing. Right? And he's doing it in one of the most cowardly and contemptible ways. Right? This is an extremely important point you need to understand. Okay? We live in one of the most litigious societies in the history of the world, not named the United States of America. Okay? Right? By litigious, I mean lawsuits, right? Litigation. Okay? Right? The amount of lawsuits that are filed every single day in this country are mind-boggling, that are only put on steroids when you talk about the Americans. Right? Lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit. Right? It's why we have this term now in English called lawfare, right? A purposeful pun on warfare with a W, right? Lawfare, L-A-W, right? Because we used to have honour in our culture and in our society where if you actually had a problem with a man, you would fight him. If you're talking about between men. You would duel him. You would fight him bare knuckle. You would fight him with pistols. You would fight him with swords, right? A totally foreign concept to modern man in every regard, right? However, the reasoning for that is because it's a pressure valve to release these problems. If you have a problem with someone, right, man to man, at least in this particular regard we're talking about here, right, because that's the example that's been given here, instead of actually hiding behind the formalities and the pseudoture of courtrooms, actually put your hands to work. And by the way, historically, Christians were not strictly against this. They were in certain regards, right? So eventually champion justice. So this is the kind of justice where, for example, if I was accused of a crime, right, and it was really serious, well, I could demand a trial by combat. Okay? I would physically defend myself, or if I was wealthy enough, I would put forward my champion, as David is put forward by Saul. Okay? And the king would put forward his champion, right, as Goliath was by the Philistines. And then they duke it out, and whoever wins, that is the sign from God that this side is right and the other side is wrong. Okay? That's how the ancient world worked. That is exactly actually what's going on in the story of David and Goliath. Okay? It is not a biblical form of justice, so eventually that was phased out in Christian Europe, right, in Christendom. However, the point that is being drawn here is that there is something fundamentally cowardly and contemptible about seeking to attack someone through judicial means. Right? It is total and utter cowardice. You will hide behind the ostensible formalities and properness, right, the propriety in that literal sense, of courtrooms and of standing and sitting at the right time and of eloquence of speech and of the procedural formalities, all those things, as if this is some civilized process and as if you're not just doing this to destroy someone's life. Right? It is an utterly contemptible culture that does that. So contemptible. It's so cowardly. Right? That's the one we live in. Okay? Because there's no actual honesty in doing things in these ways. That's why this guy is being called malicious. It's one of the reasons why he's being called malicious. Right? He's falsely accusing someone. Now, the question that might come into mind then, and this is extremely important to think about, why would someone do that? Why is it that one would make a false accusation? Well, with all due respect, and God bless you if you don't quite understand why immediately, right? Your innocence is admirable, but it has its limitations. To steal, rob, defame, defraud, kill, destroy. That's why this particular word is used, that also contains within it the idea of violating, right? Violence. To attack. Yeah? This is warfare, but by other means, hence why we have that modern English term of lawfare. Okay? Entities do not go to war anymore, other than in the most particular cases, right, internationally. Right? They instead, one corporation sues another, right? And especially if they want to take over a corporation, they want to conquer it, right? A hostile takeover. Well, the best way to do that is to simply file lawsuit and lawsuit and lawsuit and lawsuit and bury that smaller firm under so many years of paperwork that they cannot possibly maintain the legal fees, and it literally becomes a war of attrition to the point where that firm goes bankrupt, they go into administration, and you scoop in and buy it for pennies on the dollar and conquer that company. That is just warfare by other means, guys. Right? This is what's being described at this microcosmic example of one guy accusing another. Right? It's malicious to do so. Right? It is an attack that is being spoken of. That's why in the Proverbs, one of the wisdom literatures, right? Proverbs chapter 25, verse 18, like a club and a sword and a sharp arrow, in other words, weapons of warfare, is a man who bears false witness against his neighbour. Right? So someone who bears false witness, which is what this is talking about, literally false witness, right? Violation of one of the 10 commandments, bearing false witness, right? Commandment number 9, in this particular case, is being likened to weapons of war, right? War hammers, arrows, swords. That's what that man is like. So notice that we have that English term lawfare. This is actually picking up on something which even the ancients described. They considered this kind of thing to be warfare, because that's what it is. Now, how pertinent is this to Christians, right? Hear this point. We as Christians in the modern world, in the West, do not face, in a general respect at least, invading armies with swords or shields, or I suppose these days guns, and with artillery and with naval forces and with air assaults and so on and so forth. Right? No, we face lawsuits. We face smear campaigns. We face media attacks. We face all these kinds of things. It is warfare, but by other means. Okay? Warfare is not one-dimensional. It's never been one-dimensional, right? Take that from someone who's from a military family. Okay? Warfare has always been multifaceted. Pulling out a gun is but one, often at times very limited solution to problems that can be resolved in far more effective ways outside of down the barrel of a gun. Okay? Why assassinate someone in the literal sense of assassinating someone? Right? Drawing attention to that person, martyring them effectively if you talk about religious or political things these days. Why do something so overtly violent that will almost certainly land you in jail anyway, when you can simply launch a defaming and derogatory campaign against them through media or other means and destroy their reputation? You achieve the exact same goal. In fact, you actually achieve it even better. The risk with just assassinating opponents, right, to give you some of the Machiavellian game theory here, is that you run the risk of martyring them, of elevating them to a status of herodom. But if you can undercut them, undermine them, destroy their reputation publicly, plant evidence, falsely accuse, all these kinds of things that go into such an intelligence campaign like that, then the masses of people will destroy them for you. Right? You as Christians, we as Christians, need to be so vividly aware of how this works in the real world so that we are not duped and fooled. Okay? You cannot begin to comprehend how immensely sophisticated and how astonishingly and shockingly capable the world of intelligence operations is. I wouldn't even know where to begin trying to explain it. Right? The ways in which intelligence and psychological operations are given and fed to you every day through news and through all kinds of things to bring this political leader down, or this public servant to move them over, or to get rid of this particular CEO, or to even all the way down to individual levels. The ways in which these things are done are so manifestly and manifoldly complex that we hardly ever see them unless we know what we're looking at. Malicious witness. Yeah? Now the flip side of that, to give us some comfort and respite, right, is that when these things are done against us, and quite frankly this would go for anyone, even if you were non-Christian, I'd be saying the same thing, right? But in our case, talking to the Christians. When these things are done against us, what should be our response? Should it be to go into panic mode? Should it be to backpedal and backtrack? Should it be offering retractions? Should it be ever saying the fatal nail in the coffin in these scenarios, which is the word sorry? No. To give you a bit of the inside cricket, right? If you have been falsely accused of something, right, and you know it's false, right, never, ever, under any circumstances whatsoever, apologise. Do you understand? Never. If you have not done something that you're being accused of, do you have something to apologise for, yes or no? No. Okay. What happens when you say sorry? When you apologise for something? To try and, in a vain attempt, to try and diffuse the attack. You immediately confirm it. You confirm it. Because an apology is by definition a concession. It is, technically speaking, a confession. Right? It's a confession. So what are you confessing to? Because you didn't do it. Right? Never, ever apologise. Never say sorry in the face of these accusations. Okay? Because you're immediately telling everyone else who's watching this, well, I actually did do it, and I'm taking responsibility for it, and I'm sorry. Because you as a Christian rightly know that when we do actually sin and when we do things that are wrong, the path of absolution and salvation is what? Confess our sins. Yeah? Seek God's forgiveness. That is exactly what this religion is. Cool. If you've actually done the thing. Do you understand? If you've done it. Because if not, you're falsely confessing, which itself is sinful anyway. So there's literally no respect in which this actually makes sense. Right? It's not arrogance, it's not pride, yeah, it's not hubris to rightly defend yourself. Okay? When Paul in the Gospel, St. Paul, in the book of Acts, pardon me, when St. Paul in the book of Acts was being accused of all manner of things, did he ever admit to the Jewish council or to the Roman one that he was guilty of these things? No. No, he called the whole thing out as an utter kangaroo court, in other words, a total waste of time and a joke, right? And threw them into derision. When Christ our Lord was being accused, falsely, of the variety and the smorgasbord of things that the Jewish Sanhedrin were attempting to throw at him, did he ever confess and apologise for any one of those things? No. No. We're literally told he stood silent. Right? He never apologised for any of it. Right? He's saying he's the Son of God. Yep. Yeah, because he is. And he's proven it to you 6 ways to Sunday. And he's going to prove it to you again in 3 days when you all see him walking around again. Right? Never apologise in the face of these malicious attacks. Someone calls you sexist, someone calls you bigoted, someone calls you racist, someone calls you homophobic, someone calls you transphobic, someone calls you any one of these utterly vacuous terms, so grossly overspent that they basically have no currency anymore. So what? Are you any of those things? Do you actually have like a deep-seated, irrational fear and hatred of the sodomite? No? Okay, that's not true, is it? So what are you apologising for? What are you apologizing for? Okay? Apply that to any circumstance you want on almost any issue. Because once you see this, you'll understand that the aspect of the malicious accuser, right, is a fundamentally satanic thing. Right? It's literally satanic. Right? The name Satan means the accuser. Right? He who accuses. Okay? In this case, it's malicious, it's false. So have the wisdom to see it. It's precisely why the analogy that is given by Christ in the Gospels is to be as wise as what? Serpents. Why is he using demonic imagery in the form of a serpent? Right? Because that's what that's referring to, right? Draconic imagery, serpentine imagery. To see and understand through the facade that's presented publicly what the actual satanic evil motive is. Do you understand? Have the wisdom, the sagacity, to see through the facade that's put on publicly. The facade plays on your heartstrings, right? It tugs on your emotions. It P-R-E-Y preys upon your goodwill and your trust and your charity and your compassion and your love. But it is doing that to exploit you. Not every single time, so we don't fall into cynicism, right? That's what I talked about earlier. We don't fall into indifference, right? Cynical indifference, but we also don't fall into gullible, naive credulity of just believing everything. Yeah? Same goes on the reverse end when the attack comes toward us. Thus, to finish in these last 3 verses for us ultimately, right? So 3 verses from 18 onward. And the judges shall inquire thoroughly. Inquire thoroughly. Not take a cursory glance, not just take the witness's word for it. Inquire thoroughly, due process, yeah? And behold, if the witness is a false witness, and he has accused his brother falsely, right, so he violates the 9th commandment, bearing false witness, then you shall do to him just as he intended to do to his brother. Thus you shall purge the evil from among you. And the rest, in other words, the society around, will hear of it and be afraid and never again do such an evil thing among you. This is proportional justice. Yeah? He accuses this guy of, let's just say the highest level, murder. What was going to be the consequence for that man if he had have actually done it and been found guilty? He would face death penalty. So what should happen to the guy who falsely accuses him of that? He should face the death penalty. Now, before we quake in our boots, in some sense of false pity, the kind of which was warned against a couple of weeks ago, the kind of which you're about to be warned against right now, immediately after this, in the coming verse 21, yeah? That man knows full well what the penalty is. He is accusing this man of, in this example, murder anyway. So what do you think that man wants to do to that man? He wants to see him dead. Do you understand that? That's how serious this is, right? And apply this at any level you want. He is seriously willing to lie, to defraud the court, to perjure himself in the technical sense, right, of bearing false witness in the context of a court. He's willing to do all of these things with the end goal that that guy gets hung from a tree. Do you understand? This puts into perspective the word malicious in regard to attack. Yeah? Because the reason why that's a perfect example is because in the context of, well, it's always been the case, but especially today with media, modern media, technological media, you do not have to shoot someone. You do not have to stab someone. You do not have to physically kill the person to kill the person. Do you understand? The mere accusation of crimes today is more than sufficient to see you never gainfully employed ever again, to see you blacklisted from entire industries because you're now toxic, right? They don't want to be within 10 feet of you, right? Because corporations are so dependent on public imagery, especially in regard to economics and markets and like stock markets, especially if they're publicly listed. What happens if that company, right, here's the accusation, they fire you through their caustic HR department, and then you go seeking job elsewhere in whatever it is. You're in finance, you're in engineering, you're in literally pick anything you want. The company that then hires you is now the company that hired an accused rapist. Is now the company that hired a man who was accused of embezzling corporate funds. Pick any crime or supposed crime that you want, right? Doesn't matter. Insert whatever. It all's the same. They're now the company that is linked in the media to that headline. What do you think the incentive is for that board or for that business owner, whatever level you're talking about, to want to do that? Zero. Right? Unless they have something that is vanishingly rare in modern society. Okay? It used to define us as human beings. Right? It's called a spine. Okay? Instead of the invertebrate worms that we have largely turned into, especially at levels of leadership, okay, who squiggle and wiggle all the way around anything even vaguely controversial, right? We used to have things that actually kept us upright and erect. Yeah? Spine. So if a business owner in that example actually has integrity and actually gives a tinker's cuss about truth, they won't care about false accusations. Right? But of course, that's not the society you live in any longer. This is why you as a Christian have no business at all whatsoever in participating in malicious, slander, gossip, online, in person, any of these things. Because these are the new weapons of warfare. They've always been there, but this is now the way in which it's done. Right? This person wants to destroy this person. They don't just go and kill them. They don't engage in combat, actual armed combat. They don't launch a war. They don't raise an army. They don't bomb them. They don't shoot them. They don't stab them. They don't do any of those things. Right? Plant the seeds of an accusation and let human psychology and corporate corruption, media corruption do the rest. Okay? This protects against that. Because, you're going to accuse this man or this woman of a particular crime? That's cool, right? Sure, we'll listen to you and we'll evaluate this thoroughly. Those are the words we already saw, remember? Right? So we're not just going to go, nah, doesn't sound plausible. No, we're going to investigate it, but you better understand that if you're not telling the truth, if you're perjuring yourself, if you're lying, there is a sword of Damocles, proverbially speaking, hanging above your head. Whatever the crime, whatever the sentence, the judgment was going to be for that guy or that gal, is going to be done to you. That's not the case, if you're wondering, by the way, in the way that the modern sentencing works. Okay? Perjury penalties are exorbitantly less than any of the crimes that are ever actually accused, right? So people can do it with impunity. Okay? This is a real problem across certain areas, right? The big problem is, of course, because of just general sexual degeneracy and of naivety and of foolishness and of youthful idealism, right? Either a man or a woman or both, usually the woman against the man, not always, but usually, right? Regretting decisions of that one-night stand or going back after the club or going back after whatever and then changing minds and then accusing, okay, of sexual assault, right? If you want to destroy any young man's life, or vice versa if it goes the opposite direction, right, just simply accuse them of sexual assault or rape. Right? That happens. Okay? This protects against it. Because we're ultimately told, verse 21, thus, right, therefore, in other words, your eye shall not pity him. Life for life, eye for eye. tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Right? Lex talionis, as we call it in the West. Right? The law of exact retribution. Okay? Proportional justice, not imbalanced. Yeah? So we don't put to death people for stealing a bag, the 14-year-old kid for stealing a bag of chips from the servo. Okay? Right? And we also don't give 24 to 36 months for raping women. Both of those are disproportionate in either direction. Yeah? Okay. In this case, what's he talking about? Well, the one who falsely accuses has to face justice that is proportional to whatever would have happened to the person who was falsely accused. And that way, the society will know that lying through your teeth, yeah, either completely outright or even just usually as it goes, half-truths, right? You give part of the story but then purposely omit the rest, okay? Whatever it is, you will actually face consequences because right now there's utter impunity. You can just do whatever you want, right? Make a statement on social media, no ramifications, right? That's why churches have to be much more organised and actually paying attention to what's being done, right? Because just falsely levelling things, gossiping on social media is just not on. So beyond not on, right? You can destroy people, right? It is murder but by other forms. Murdering a man or a woman's reputation can potentially be a penalty worse than death. Because at least there's a sense of finality, right, in the death, in the physical death. By destroying someone's reputation falsely, not talking about justly, talking about falsely, right? You are condemning them to wander the rest of their life in infamy, right? Where there is no forgiveness in the hearts of men, except for those who are humble enough to know that they have been forgiven by God. But the problem is, yeah, this guy, this gal didn't do it, right? I want to leave you with this because this is really where the kind of hammer hits the actual mallet here, right? At least in the case of someone who has done something evil, right? Who's done something wrong, criminal or otherwise, okay? There is a genuine path to redemption and forgiveness by owning up to that, confessing that, seeking restitution for that, right? Apologizing to God and man for that. All those things are all true, even for the most heinous of things. I mean, I mentioned St. Paul earlier. This guy was a mass murderer, like in every literal sense. This dude's job was hunting Christians, right? He led death squads for years. God forgives him. Right? The Church of Damascus, whom he was sent to hunt, eventually comes around to forgiving him. Right? Ironically, God forgives even easier than we do. This is the old story of Jonah and Nineveh, right? He doesn't want to go to Nineveh in the Old Testament. He doesn't want to go to the Assyrians, the pagans, for the explicit reason that he says, I know that you're merciful and compassionate, and these Assyrians don't deserve your mercy and compassion, says me, Jonah. Right? God is quicker to forgive than we are. The issue is not about God's compassion or forgiveness or his mercy, his grace. That's not the issue. You can find forgiveness for actually having done something wrong. But to be falsely accused, to be slandered, to have your reputation destroyed when you haven't done anything wrong, you are literally trapped in a prison. Because you can't apologize. You haven't done anything wrong. So the black cloud, the spectre, the ghost, the ghoul of that accusation hangs over your head for the rest of your life. There is no way of recourse. Because you can't go to that desperate spot that I mentioned earlier to not do, of offering the false apology. Right? Well, if I apologize for it, that'll diffuse it. No, it won't. It will only incentivize the piranha frenzy. You will get dogpiled even more. Right? Because the people who would ever falsely accuse you, especially in group settings, for the love of God, Christian, please listen to me. They are malicious, they are repugnant, they are disgusting, they are disgraceful people. Yeah? Forgiveness can be found for them, but until that point, until they actually humble themselves before God, these are the most contemptible people. You have to be truly, truly twisted and evil to actually seek to destroy someone else's life through false accusation. Okay? Your heart is just a sunless space. Do you understand? Your conscience, your psyche is blackened and dark, like an abyss. That's the kind of person that does that. Yeah? Cowards who are seeking to destroy other people through words and not the actual more honourable way of doing things, quote unquote, which would actually be physically proving yourself. Right? So we as Christians must have no part in doing such things. Right? You hear someone coming to tell you, even if it's just in the mundane sense, someone's coming to you with some salacious story, the first question that should be in your mind is, why am I hearing about this? Why? Is this some pertinent piece of information I need to know? Well, no. Okay, so why am I hearing it? Right? Does this have something directly to do with me? No. Okay. Then politely ask your friend, even if they're a Christian, why are you telling me this? Right? Oh, I just thought you'd be interested to know. No, that's not a reason. How do you know that's true? Right? Actual questions which are not comfortable to ask in polite settings, but are actually the honest way of doing things. Yeah? That would be the ethical way of doing things. Yeah? Have no part in gossip. Right? Because gossip destroys. When you see things on news, corporate news, social media news, whichever media avenue it is, right? That is designed to get you to believe XYZ thing without any thought process, as you just infinitely doom scroll, right, on your device, don't believe it. Verify it first and then believe it. Okay? It's not that everything that's ever told to you through media is wrong, right? As I said, I'm warning you against skepticism, but don't just automatically believe something because you just heard it. Especially if it's something, like I said, salacious, it's scandalous, it's criminal even, right? This is how an honest and just society would work, okay? This is how, as Christians, we must operate. Whether the world around us holds that standard or not, we don't have that control, right? But internally or intramurally, in your individual life, in the life of your family, in the life of this church, and in the life of your Christian community, right, as Christians around the world, this is the standard we have to hold to. Okay? This is the standard, right? Where truth matters in regard to judgment, right? It must govern the judgment itself, okay? False witness cannot just be simply allowed to spread and manifest itself, right, unchallenged. Right? Accusations must actually be tested, because ultimately, just as those words are saying, right, your eye shall not pity them, okay, everything must be judged in account. The reality is that true justice, like we've said in weeks gone by, must not be perverted by false pity. Right? God is truth. The truth is essential. The truth is defining. The truth is the arbiter of justice, not our opinions. Right? Let us strive to that standard and live out that standard in our lives and inculcate and, in fact, revigorate that culture of truth in regard to justice. Amen.